Now we'll recognize Mr. Gebolys for 5 minutes for your opening statement, please.
Good morning, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the committee. I'm Gene Gebolys, President and CEO of World Energy, one of the largest and longest-standing advanced biofuels suppliers in North America. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today on behalf of the National Biodiesel Board and the 65,000 workers associated with America's biomass-based diesel industry, who collectively generate $17 billion in economic activity, dramatically reduce our nation's reliance on fossil fuels, and substantially lighten the national carbon footprint. On August 9th, the Environmental Protection Agency announced that it had waived renewable fuel standard requirements for another 31 refineries, bringing the total issued in just the last 2 years alone to 85. The move ensured that over 4 billion gallons of biofuels would be replaced by fossil fuels in the national fuel tank, adding more than 20 million tons of carbon back into the atmosphere. For an agency whose namesake mission is environmental protection, these moves are not only alarming, but fully perplexing. For years, the EPA had routinely issued 7 or 8 waivers a year, totaling a couple hundred million gallons in total impact. But now, the most recent waiver deluge set off a wave of plant closures impacting thousands of workers in biofuels, agriculture, and related industries. On August 16th, 1 week after the EPA announcement, I had to tell our employees, suppliers, and the communities where we work that we were shutting down production at our plants in Rome, Georgia, Natchez, Mississippi, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, as a direct result of the EPA's misuse of its small refinery exemption authority. Our closures alone impacted more than 100 workers directly and many hundreds more indirectly. An analysis conducted at the University of Illinois found that small refinery exemptions issued over just the last 2 years have slashed demand for biomass-based diesel by over 2 billion gallons, with the economic damage expected to reach $7.7 billion. The blowback to the latest round of waivers has been swift and widespread, and by the end of August, President Trump promised a giant package to address the problems stemming from EPA's excessive use of waivers. On October 4th, the White House announced that a deal had been reached to use an average of the gallons exempted over the previous 3 years to estimate expected 2020 waivers and establishing the renewable fuel volume obligations for the coming year. While the deal would not make up for the billions of gallons of advanced biofuels demand already lost, if implemented correctly, it promised to soften the blow of exemptions in the future. Now, the EPA has offered its proposed solution in the form of a supplemental rulemaking, and regrettably, it falls woefully short of the President's advanced billing. Again, the EPA has gone astray. Now, instead of taking the average of the waivers EPA actually granted over the last 3 years, the agency is proposing to offset in 2020 the average volume that the Department of Energy originally recommended that the EPA grant. Why? Because what DOE advised is dramatically lower than what EPA has actually done. Now we know what we suspected all along, that EPA ignored DOE recommendations and handed out nearly twice as much waiver volume as DOE had recommended. As hard as that is to fathom, it's harder still to understand why it would make sense for EPA to now go back to the very same DOE recommendations it blatantly ignored to account for next year's proposed waivers. The agency is doing nothing to assure that they will discontinue the practice of promoting compliance avoidance over compliance, and is doing little to establish RFS stakeholder confidence that the agency intends to chart a new course based on the plain intent of Congress to grow the nation's use of advanced biofuels. EPA's job is to administer the law Congress enacted, not to rewrite it. EPA must be held to account to do the public's bidding in public. There should be nothing secretive about who gets waivers, why they get them, and for how many gallons the relief is provided. There is absolutely nothing confidential about the damage our industry is experiencing. How can it be reasonable that those seeking non-compliance can be allowed to continue to lurk in EPA's shadows when those of us impacted by their actions have nowhere to hide? When EPA finalizes its 2020 renewable fuel obligations rule by the end of this year, it must fully account for small refinery exemptions, those actually given, not those recommended but ignored. The agency must recognize and support the biodiesel industry's ability to grow under the RFS in 2020 and beyond, as Congress intended. The war on biofuels and agriculture must end. It's time for the secret waiver program to be brought into the light and for EPA to reestablish public trust.
Thank you. And Mr. Gebolys, your company has existed and grown since the RFS began. Is having confidence and certainty in the RVO important for investments and business decisions that you've made?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. The big investment that we're working on right now is our renewable aviation fuel and renewable diesel facility in Los Angeles. We've announced a project to expand capacity there substantially. We'll be investing hundreds of millions of dollars. We're making that investment because of California legislation, not because of the federal legislation. At our plant in Houston, Texas, where we have been working on a substantial expansion, we've had to put that project on hold because that project only serves the non-California market. So just by looking at those two facilities alone, we're spending money in California because California policy works. We're not spending money in Texas because federal policy doesn't work.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask the panel, as automobiles and truck fleets turn over to more efficient vehicles, what will this do for the demand for fuels? Do the statutory blending goals of the RFS program still make sense when looking at the future of the transportation fleet? Now maybe one.
So my business works primarily on the diesel side of the equation. On the diesel side, the equipment tends to exist for a very long time. So the transition on the diesel side will be slow in coming. Progress will come, and that's a good thing. Vehicles should get more efficient. We should move to cleaner and better technologies over time. But we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. While we are transitioning to cleaner and better technologies, we have cleaner and better technologies today. Advanced biofuels are called advanced because they reduce carbon footprint by 50% or more. And it's important that we continue to do what the RFS was put in place to do, which is to continue to use more of them while we continue to use diesel equipment.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Certainly the more...
Hearing what you believe should be done to address the implementation of the statute while protecting the interest of small refiners from disproportionate harm, as Congress had envisioned. Anybody want to start that?
This really isn't very complicated on the existing RFS side. The law is extremely straightforward. At this point in the program, advanced biofuels are supposed to be making up the vast majority of the program's growth. The SREs are have clearly caused that not only to stop, but to start to retrench. We don't have to look any farther than the data that AFPM has put up there earlier and keeps pointing to. That data clearly makes my point. The expansion should be happening in the advanced biofuel sector now. It's not because the SREs. We need to have a light shined on what's happening in the SRE program.
Do you think the RIN market has functioned properly throughout the lifetime of the RFS program? And if you do think there is a problem with the RIN market, how has it affected your business or industry?
Yeah, the fundamental logic of the RIN component of the RFS makes perfect sense. And theoretically, it should work perfectly fine, and largely does when there's open access to information. But when some participants in a market have more information than others. Markets don't function properly. The fundamental structure of the RIN market makes sense, the fundamental logic of the RFS makes sense, but it all is dependent on EPA administering the program such that all market participants have the same amount of information at the same time.
Let me just ask Mr. Gebolys if I'm pronouncing it right. Your company has been in business for about 20 years, a little longer than the RFS program has existed. And the original RFS granted a blanket exemption for small refineries for several years in the beginning of the program. And when the blanket exemption in the law expired, EPA continued to approve some small refinery exemptions virtually every year. In your testimony, you say that recently you've had to close 3 facilities. So my question is, has this type of setback happened in past years when there were fewer small refinery exemptions?
Thank you for the question. As you point out, in the early days of the RFS, there were waivers given as of right, and then subsequently extensions of those. Starting around 2012, companies had to apply for the waivers, and there were only a few given. Some were 7, 8. Totaling about 200 million gallons annually. Those were relatively modest. They didn't substantially change the markets. In the early going, they didn't change markets at all because they were the waived gallons were picked up by other obligated parties. Only starting 15, 18 months ago, with the very significant expansion of the waiver program, did it show up in decreased RIN values, which go directly to our economics and our ability to produce.
All right, but in your testimony, you said that one of your products is sustainable aviation fuel, and last week we had a hearing on the transportation sector with a representative, Nestle, who talked about the need to increase demand for this fuel if we're to lower climate pollution from the aviation sector. So let me just ask a couple of questions. Are we going to get new investment in alternative fuels without the RFS?
It makes it very difficult. As I was pointing out earlier, we're investing in California because California is investing in California. With the signals that we're getting out of the EPA, it makes it very difficult to invest. Not only does it chill demand in the moment, it makes it very hard to project forward an environment in which we can justify investments today that will have to pay out over time.
And this because the EPA continues to grant large number of exemptions, or what is it?
For us, directly so. I think there's been a lot of quoting of studies one way or the other. There's absolutely zero question that the small refinery exemptions are killing demand in biodiesel and advanced biofuels.
And so, what kind of signals is this, implementation of the RFS sent to the investment community with respect to advanced biofuels, essentially?
Well, it's not a positive one.
So I just have one question to start with for everybody on the panel. I think businesses generally would have a problem with a blanket statement that anything submitted to the government that was unique to their operations competitive position should be given to the general public, right? So my question, does that seem reasonable to each of you? And kind of a yes or no if you can. All right, let me work down the panel here.
So a company chooses to seek an exemption. I cannot fathom why it doesn't make sense for that company to reveal who they are, where they are, and why they are seeking the exemption.
Thank you all. Mr. Gebolys and Mr. Cooper, for many years I've been promoting policies to increase the use of woody biomass in our environmental policies. Given the great forest stocks we have and the need to thin out our forests and trying to figure out markets to pay for all that. So I recently visited an innovative project in Lakeview, Oregon, where Red Rock Biofuels is constructing a gasification facility. Now that will turn woody biomass into jet and diesel fuel, and they already have contracts. This is the first gasification project in the world to use woody biomass from forest thinning and related activities. It may serve as a blueprint for producing advanced renewable biodiesel and at the same time help keep forests healthy and more resilient to these awful wildfires we've been having. So I understand it already has contracts with Southwest Airlines, FedEx, and DoD. One problem is, due to RFS and tax credit prohibitions, the project cannot take biomass from federal lands or wood chips from the local mill. Yet there's no way to determine whether the chips are from federal or private land since its source is from both. So from your perspective, what are the prospects that innovative projects like this can provide additional fuel sources for biodiesel and transportation fuels, and what will be the impact on greenhouse gas emissions? Do either of you want to
So
comment?
I can't speak to that particular project, but in general, the way innovation happens is that there are market signals set, and then companies compete to respond to those. And so whether it's the project that you refer to or the project that we're doing in Los Angeles or projects that are happening throughout the country, that is what the RFS was meant to do. It was meant to drive innovation. It was meant to push forward. And so I can't speak to the particular.
Well, you come out and visit, and then you could. We'd be
So the questions are this: do you agree that liquid fuel vehicles will have to find ways to improve fuel economy and lower emissions? And B, do you believe that a high octane standard is the most effective way to improve the fuel economy of liquid fuel powered vehicles? Mr. Gebolys.
Yeah, obviously the world's changing, and we're going to get to greater and greater efficiency, and the liquid fuels market's going to have to change with it.
Do you feel that high octane standards are a way to achieve that?
I don't have an opinion on that one way or the other.
We have not seen the level of deployment of advanced fuels that was originally envisioned under the RFS. Where we can point to issues that have come up over the years, it's also clear that difference in emissions between this administration and the last is having an impact here. For example, the EPA under President Trump has put a freeze on all new cellulosic biofuel registrations and pathways. Mr. Cooper or Mr. Gebolys, how has this freeze impacted the ability to deploy a higher percentage of advanced biofuels, specifically cellulosic biofuels, into our fuel mix? And if you could be quick, make it quickly.
Yeah, I can't speak to cellulosic, although it has. But more directly, by far the largest advanced biofuel in the country is biodiesel and biomass-based diesel. And the impact on biomass-based diesel has been severe and immediate. All of the expansion in the RFS is supposed to be in the advanced biofuel sector as of 2016, and we have flatlined despite the fact that the basic concept of the RFS was that the program would be emphasizing advanced biofuels, all of which have a 50% greater reduction in carbon impact.
Gebolys, one of the biggest complaints surrounding how the EPA has managed the SRE program is that there's been a lack of transparency. That's come up several times this morning. And with these waivers that's being granted, who's receiving them? Would you say that all the secretive and capricious nature of the SREs can have a destabilizing effect on the renewable energy sector, specifically with regard to ethanol production and job loss?
There's no question that the secretive nature destabilizes markets. Some market participants have information, others don't. You can't have a functioning market like that. If I might just quickly add to your previous question to Mr. Cooper, look, we can quote all the studies we want. I had to make a decision to close 3 plants. I couldn't personally be in 3 places at the same time, so I had to do those by video. One after another, even through video, I made eye contact with the folks that were going to be furloughed later that same day. There is zero question that these SREs are crushing small refineries. They're just biorefiners.
Thank you.
Mr. Gebolys, did I pronounce your name right? The Greener Fuels Act, which I support, supports advanced biofuels, and that, as I understand it, is what the RFS was originally intended for. Can the RFS, as it is now, get us to a broader demand and use of advanced biofuels? And what are the major reforms to the program needed to achieve this goal?
Thanks very much for the question. The response is absolutely the RFS, as it is currently constructed, is not an ethanol mandate. It is a broad biofuels pushing structure that was designed to start with conventional biofuels, get to a maximum of 15 billion gallons of ethanol by 2016, and then all of the growth after that is designed to be in the advanced category.
But it's not there.
I'm sorry?
We're not getting it.
We're not getting it because we're getting SREs instead. I see Mr. Thompson react to my comment, but that is absolutely what is happening. There's an economist at the University of Illinois named Scott Irwin.
Right.
He's written a paper in March of this most recent year that lays it out in 3 very easily read pages on exactly how that is impacting us.
And without having an argument about the net carbon impact of ethanol, there's no question that advanced biofuels have a much more significant carbon reduction impact. Would you speak to that, Mr. Gebolys?
Yeah, you can't be in advanced biofuels unless you demonstrate without any question that your fuel reduces carbon by no less than 50%. In the biodiesel world, many of ours, depending on what you're using for feedstock, reduce the carbon impact by upwards of 85%. The other thing that I wanted to address is the issue about food versus fuel. The reason that soybeans, which are the main source of feedstock for biodiesel, the reason those are grown is for the protein, not the oil. And when you get a higher net back to the oil, the protein actually becomes less expensive. You get more value in the bean from the oil contribution, and the protein, which is the good stuff, actually becomes less expensive. So the growth of advanced biofuels actually goes hand in hand with the growth of protein.